Good evening. Welcome to Money Matters. My name is Anthony Wilson.
And I'm Judy Canhai. Coming up in this week's program, a manufacturing firm that has been around for the past 38 years tells us how its operations are being affected by the slowdown in the construction industry and how it's doing everything that it can to maintain its current staff. And you'll hear from Jamie Rupnarayan, a stay-at-home dad. He tells us why he decided to stay at home with his 3 children as opposed to working.
But first up, I speak with Wade George, who is the tax partner at EY, about the property tax. Good evening, Wade George, tax partner at EY. Do you agree with the proposition that an economic downturn is not a good time to introduce a property tax?
Well, first of all, good evening, Anthony. Good evening to your viewers. Thank you for having me. I think I can answer that question 2 ways. From one perspective, the government is now in most dire need of additional revenues. And so, if you recall, the recurrent revenue expected this year, as announced in the 2017 budget, was 38 billion. The expenditure was 53 billion. And the expectation was about 503 million from property tax. So clearly this was a critically important revenue item for the government. At the same time, you're quite correct. Things are difficult for people, and therefore an increased tax would be least affordable, especially when you consider that it comes amongst many increases in the tax base, which we can talk about later.
So why do you think the government opted to introduce the tax on properties, on residential properties first?
Okay, so it seems that the government is definitely leading in terms of communication and so on with residential properties, but it's not clear to me that industrial and commercial will not be included. I assume that that would be the case, and those other industries would be included because they're going to be significant contributors. As to the question as to why lead with residential, it's an interesting question. From one perspective, you're attempting to broaden the tax base, and so residential will obviously touch the most people. From the other perspective, I think it's politically the area you're going to get the most noise, and not necessarily economically the area where you would get the most bang for your buck.
In 2014, when the former Minister of Finance, Larry Hawaii, spoke about bringing back the property tax, he said industrial, commercial, and then residential. In fact, he had a 3-year plan: industrial first, commercial second, residential third.
Correct.
In 2017.
Correct.
So why do you think this government has veered away from that proposition?
You're absolutely correct. Under the previous administration, the trajectory was going to be industrial first. Now, economically, one would imagine that if you use the 80-20 principle, most of the money would come from a small concentration of taxpayers. And in the industrial space, you would have more complicated issues around valuation, and you may want to have obviously work those through first. But as a country, we also have to recognize that, especially in the heavy manufacturing space, those industries are dealing with a multiplicity of commercial issues at this time.
Why do you think the government opted for an annual rental value instead of some other kind of mechanism for valuing residential properties?
Yeah, I mean, again, a very good question. Many territories, even in the Caribbean, use a capital value, or sort of like what fair market purchase price would be. And the government has opted to use a sort of a rental value. I mean, at the end of the day, it's 6 of one, half dozen of the next. And therefore, one could extrapolate from a capital value, a rental value, and of course, apply the tax rate accordingly. So I'm not that concerned around the approach taken, although intuitively it's a little bit difficult for people to grasp, for example, in the residential setting, how they can derive a rent especially when it's an owner-occupied
Right.
home. But from a valuation perspective, one can pretty easily work back from a capital value to a rental value.
And do you think 3% of the annual rental value is reasonable?
You know, Anthony, my feeling is that this tax on the residential side is not going to be as onerous as imagined. Obviously, people are reacting to the lack of certainty. People are reacting to what they perceive to be potentially a lack of confidentiality or a loss of a confidentiality by letting persons into their home or making pictures available of their home. So I could understand the uncertainty and the fear around confidentiality. But at the end of the day, I have to believe, given the amount budgeted for the overall tax, which is about 503 million, which is less than 2% of taxes collected or to be collected in this year's budget, and statements made by the Ministry of Finance around the type of valuation approach that would be used, that the valuation is not going to be as onerous as imagined by folks. But until they see it occur, I think there would be the apprehension.
So what about all of the safeguards in the legislation? For example, the possibility of deferrals.
No, there's definitely a lot of recourse to taxpayers in the event that they're upset by the valuation being too high or not fair. And there is objection mechanisms and recourse to the courts. Recourse, first of all, to objection to either through the Commission of Valuations or through the BIR, and then right the way up through the Tax Appeal Board, Court of Appeal, etc. So there's definitely recourse in legislation. There's also provisions in the legislation dealing with tax deferral for those persons who are not able to meet their obligations and so on. So again, I think it's a lot more about anxiety than necessarily what would be the reality once the tax starts to be implemented on the residential side.
Why do you think there's been so much noise with regard to the government's proposal to introduce the property tax?
One has to ask oneself the question whether or not people are reacting to the proposition of value for money. If you take yourself back decades in Trinidad and Tobago now, the majority of government expenditure has been paid for by the energy sector. And that doesn't touch the majority of the population. And we've faced a situation where tax rates have gone down over the period. If you recall, from about 2005, there is reform, and the corporation tax rate went down from, I want to say, periods of time over 40% to the 25%, similar reductions in individual taxes. And that was being mainly paid for by the energy sector. So now that you have a situation where the energy sector can no longer contribute to the extent it did in the past, and there's been a significant fall off in energy revenues, and the rest of the population is being asked to pay for the government services, subsidies, etc., the conversation around real value for money is emerging. And I think that's a good conversation, to be honest with you.
Okay, thank you very much. Coming up next, Judy speaks with Stuart Dalglish, the CEO at SEL Limited, a construction company, about the downturn in the Trinidad and Tobago economy. Money Matters will be right back.